Introduction to Frostiana, or A History of the River Thames in a Frozen State. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Lewis Fletcher. Frostiana, or A History of the River Thames in a Frozen State, by George Davis. Introduction, containing an account of the late frost. The late severe frost was ushered in by a fog, which for its density and duration has seldom been equalled. The winter of 1795 was marked by much the same circumstances as the present. The nights were so extremely foggy that torches were used in the streets, coals were 4 shillings a bushel, and vegetables extremely dear. But the only fog at all comparable to that of 1813 was one which happened on the evening of New Year's Day 1730, when many lives were lost in London in consequence. The fog was so dense that several persons fell into Fleet Ditch and others into the canal in St. James's Park by mistaking their way. Much damage was also done on the Thames. The great fog which preceded the late frost commenced in London on the evening of the 27th of December 1813, about 2 hours before Lord Castlereagh set out from London on his way to embark for the Continent. Happily his lordship proceeded on his journey without interruption. It was not so with the Prince Regent, who, intending to pay a visit to the Marquis of Salisbury at Hatfield House, was obliged to return back to Carlton House after one of his outriders had fallen into a ditch on this side of Kentish Town, and which short excursion occupied several hours. Mr. Croker of the Admiralty, also wishing to proceed on a visit northward, wandered in the dark for several hours without making more than 3 or 4 miles' progress. This tremendous fog, or darkness that might be felt, continued until the 3rd of January. On most of the roads, excepting the High North Road, travelling was performed with the utmost danger, and the progress of the mails was greatly impeded. On Wednesday the 29th of December, the Birmingham mail was nearly 7 hours in going from the post office to a mile or 2 below Uxbridge, a distance of 20 miles only. On this and the other evenings, the short stages in the neighbourhood of London had 2 persons with links running by the horses' heads. Nevertheless, with this and other precautions, some serious and many whimsical accidents occurred. Pedestrians even carried links or lanterns, and many who were not provided with these illuminators lost themselves in the most frequented and at other times well-known streets. Hackney coachmen mistook the pathway for the road and vice versa, the greatest confusion occurring. On the 31st of December, the state of the metropolis, in consequence of the increased fog, was at night truly alarming. It required great attention and knowledge of the public streets to proceed any distance, and those persons who had any material business to transact were unavoidably compelled to carry torches. The usual lamps appeared through the haze no bigger than small candles. The more careful hackney coachmen got off the box and led their horses, while others drove only at a walking pace. There were frequent meetings of carriages, and great mischief ensued. Among the passengers much caution and apprehension prevailed. Many, alarmed at the idea of being run down, made exclamations, such as, "Who is coming? Mind! Take care!" etc. Females, who had ventured abroad before the fog came on, were placed under great peril. Several missed their way. Such was the extreme density of the atmosphere on Tuesday evening, the 28th, that the Maidenhead coach, on its return from town, missed the road near Harford Bridge and was overturned. Lord Hawarden was among the passengers and received an injury by the accident. Almost immediately on the cessation of the fogs, heavy falls of snow took place. There is nothing in the memory of man to equal these falls. After several shorter intervals, the snow continued incessantly for 48 hours, and this too after the ground was covered with a condensation, the result of nearly 4 weeks' continued frost. Almost the whole of the time the wind blew continually from the north and north-east, and was intensely cold. A short thaw also, which scarcely lasted 1 day, only rendered the state of the streets so much the worse. Hence the mass of snow and water became so thick that it was with difficulty that hackney coaches, with an additional horse, and other vehicles, could plough their way through. Almost all kinds of trades and callings carried on in the streets stopped, which considerably increased the distresses of the lower orders. Few carriages, even stages, could travel on the roads, which, even about town, seemed deserted. From many buildings, icicles, full 1.5 yards long, were seen suspended. The house water pipes were all frozen, whence it became necessary to have plugs in the streets for the supply of all ranks of people. The Thames, from London Bridge to Blackfriars, was for nearly a fortnight nearly completely blocked up at ebb tide. All the ponds and rivers in the neighbourhood of London were completely frozen, and skating was pursued with great avidity on the Canal in St. James's and the Serpentine in Hyde Park. On Monday, the 10th of January, the canal and the basin in the Green Park were conspicuous for the number of steel-shod heroes who covered their glassy surfaces, and who, according to their respective qualities, administered to the pleasure of the throng which crowded their banks, some by the agility and grace with which they performed their evolutions, and others by the tumbles and other accidents which marked their clumsy career. There was, as usual, a motley collection of all orders of His Majesty's subjects engaged in the busy scene, who seemed all alike eager candidates for the applause of the multitude, and whether sweep, dustman, drummer, or beau, each seemed conscious of possessing some claim, not only to his own good opinion, but to that of the fair belles who viewed his movements. There were several accidents in the course of the day, but none, we believe, of a serious nature. While these parks were thus numerously attended, Hyde Park had to boast of a more distinguished order of visitors, who, in the course of the afternoon, flocked in prodigious crowds to the banks of the Serpentine, which was covered with most excellent ice. Notwithstanding the keenness of the breeze, several females of dash, clad in robes of the richest fur, bid defiance to its chilling embrace, and on the fragile bosom of the river ventured their fair frames. The skaters were in great numbers, and were of first-rate note. Some of the most difficult movements of the art were executed with an agility and grace which excited universal admiration. A lady and 2 officers performed a reel with a precision scarcely conceivable, and attracted a very numerous circle of spectators, whose boisterous applause so completely terrified the fair cause of their ecstasy, as to induce her to forego the pleasure she herself received from the amusement, and to put an end to that which she afforded to such as were disposed to admire her in silence. 2 unfortunate accidents occurred. One skating lady dislocated the patella or knee-pan, and 5 gentlemen and a lady were immersed in the icy fluid, but received no further injury than a severe ducking. On the 20th of January, in consequence of the great accumulation of snow heaped upon the ground, it became necessary to relieve the roofs of the houses by throwing off the load collected upon them, and by these means the carriageways in the middle of the streets were rendered scarcely passable for man or horse, and all the conveniences described in page 9 and 10 were the consequence. The streams constantly flowing from the open plugs added to the general mass of ice. An enormous increase took place in the price of coals, as the river navigation and other means of conveyance were entirely obstructed. The continuation of the frost and snow induced many coach proprietors, particularly on the northern and western roads, not to continue running their coaches until a change of weather should take place. In many places where the road lies low, the snow had drifted higher than the coaches, which was the case as near town as Finchley Common. The snow had drifted into the road in the course of one night, a depth of 16 feet, and it was impassable at first, even to oxen. On Bagshot Heath there was a complete stoppage, and many accidents occurred by vehicles getting off the road. About Esher and Cobham again, the road was completely choked up. With the exception of the Kent and Essex roads, no others were passable but a few miles out of London. The coaches on the Western Road remained stationary at different parts. The Windsor coach got through the snow at Colnbrook, which was 16 feet deep, by employing about 50 labourers. Lower down, at Maidenhead Lane, the snow drifted to a great depth, and between Twyford and Reading it assumed quite a mountainous appearance. On parts of Bagshot Heath it is impossible to convey an adequate idea of its situation. The Newcastle coach went off the road into a pit upwards of 8 feet deep, but without doing mischief to either man or horse. The Middle North Road was impassable as near as Highgate Hill. On the 22nd of January, and for some days afterwards, the ice on the Serpentine River exhibited a singular appearance, from the mountains of snow which the sweepers had collected together in different situations. The spaces allotted for the skaters were in the forms of circles, squares, and oblongs. Next to the carriage ride, on the north side, were many astonishing evolutions displayed. Skipping on skates and the Turk cap backwards were among the most conspicuous. A sledge was drawn by a pony, rough-shod. The ice was not good, it being injured by a partial thaw in some places, and in others much cut up. It was highly amusing to see the most elegantly dressed females dashing through the hillocks of snow. Among the extraordinary aspects and appearances of the late severe weather, The state of the River Thames was not the least singular. Vast quantities of pieces of floating ice, loaded generally with heaps of snow, were seen almost everywhere on the surface, and being carried up and down by the tide or the stream, and collected where the projecting banks or the bridges made a resistance to the flow, and a support to the accumulation, sometimes forming a chain of glaciers, united one moment, at another clashing and cracking and dashing in a singular and awful manner. Again, when the flood beneath was not sufficiently elevated to support the mass, and when the current passed strongly, the ice islands floated away, clashing and cracking as they went, rising one over another, and then receding, covered with angry foam, as the violence of the wind or wave impelled them. In passing through the arches of the bridges, the crash was tremendous, for near the bridges the floating pieces collected about mid-water, or while the current was less forcible, and ranged themselves regularly one line upon another, the stream forcing them into order as it passed, where it made its way in force, till the increasing confinement of the channel added such violence to the conflict that a disruption took place, and the broken ice with a crash burst away again, and was carried up or down with the tide or the stream. The river was entirely frozen over for the space of a week, and a complete frost fair held upon it, a circumstantial account of which will be found in Chapter 1, Frost, page 17 and following pages. Never since the establishment of mail coaches did correspondence meet with such general interruption as on this occasion. Internal communication was completely at a stand till the roads could be in some degree cleared, for besides the drifts by which they were rendered impassable, the whole face of the country presented one uniform sheet of snow, no trace of road being discoverable, and travellers had to make their path at the risk of being every moment overwhelmed. Wagons, carts, coaches, and vehicles of all descriptions were left in the midst of the storm. The drivers, finding they could proceed no farther, took the horses to the first convenient place, and there waited till a passage could be cut to enable them to proceed with safety. Nothing could exceed the exertions of the post office in having the roads cleared in all directions for the conveyance of the mails to and from the capital. The government also very properly interfered, and instructions were sent to every parish in the kingdom to employ labourers to clear the roads. The snow accumulated in the Midland counties, particularly on the borders of Northamptonshire and Warwickshire, to a height altogether unprecedented. In the village of Dunchurch, a small village on the road to Birmingham through Coventry, and for a few miles round that place, in all directions, the drifts exceeded the height of 24 feet, and no tracks of carriages or travellers could be discovered on the roads thereabouts, except on the Great Road for many days. The Cambridge mail coach, in coming to town, sunk into a hollow part of the road, and remained in that situation, with the snow drifting over it, from 1 o'clock to 9 in the morning, when it was dragged out by 14 waggon horses. Several passengers were in the coach the whole of the time. They were nearly frozen to death. On Wednesday the 26th, the wind having veered around to the southwest, the effects of a thaw were speedily discernible. The fall of the river at London Bridge for some days presented a scene both novel and interesting. At the ebbing of the tide, huge fragments of ice were precipitated down the stream with great violence, accompanied by a noise equal to the report of a small piece of artillery. On the return of the tide, they were forced back again, but the obstacles opposed to their passage through the arches were so great as apparently to threaten a total stoppage to the navigation of the river at this essential point, and which probably would have soon taken place had the frost continued with unabated severity. On Thursday, Friday, and Saturday, the 27th, 28th, and 29th, the thaw continued, and the roads and streets were nearly impassable from floods and the accumulation of snow. But on Sunday the 30th a sharp frost set in, and continued till the next Saturday evening, the 5th of February. Accounts from the country. These narratives respecting the heavy falls of snow are truly astonishing. We select some of the most remarkable. Falmouth. The weather has been more severe in this county than has been remembered for 20 years. Heavy falls of snow, succeeded by hard frosts, have rendered all travelling by coach impracticable, and even on horseback highly dangerous. The mail coach, which started from this town for Exeter, was overturned after having proceeded a few miles, but happily no material injury was sustained by either passengers, driver, or guard. With much difficulty the coach was enabled, with the assistance of an additional pair of horses, to reach the first stage, after which all endeavours to go farther were found perfectly useless. The letters were, however, sent to Bodmin by the guard on horseback. The Falmouth and Plymouth coach has been prevented from travelling by the snow, and the passengers have been obliged to remain at St. Austell. We have no doubt that, farther to the eastward, the roads are in a still worse condition, as our last Plymouth letters mentioned that the snow was then nearly 4 feet high in several of the streets in that town, and that all coaches for Exeter, etc. are unable to travel. Liverpool, January 17th. We have now had 3 weeks of the most rigorous frost, which has been remembered for a great number of years. Fahrenheit's thermometer stood at 15 degrees, 17 below the freezing point at the Athenaeum. In the country it was no doubt much lower. Such a quantity of ice has been accumulated in the Mersey that boats could not pass over. Almost every kind of labour performed without doors is nearly at a stand. Gloucester, January 17th. The severity of the frost for the last fortnight has not been exceeded by any that has preceded it. The Severn is frozen over, and the ice is, in many places, sufficiently strong to sustain persons on its surface. Indeed, several people going to Tewkesbury Market on Wednesday last rode across the ice on horseback at the Lode, near that place. On Monday the cold was so intense that the thermometer, exposed in a northeastern aspect, stood at 13 degrees, which is 9 below the freezing point. On the eastern coast it stood as low as 9 and 10, a degree of cold very unusual in this county. Bristol, January 18th. The frost continues in this city with unusual severity. Our floating harbour now exhibits quite a novel scene. From Cumberland Basin to the feeder at the bottom of Avon Street, it is one continued sheet of ice, and for the first time in the memory of man, the skater made his appearance under Bristol Bridge. The River Severn is also frozen over at various points, so as to bear the weight of passengers. Whitehaven, January 18th. The frost, which seemed likely to continue, has increased in severity, and is at this time more intense than ever. All the ponds, streams, etc. in this neighbourhood are frozen, and there is scarcely a pump in this town that is not dry. The observations as to the thermometer are various, but all agree in ascertaining these instruments to be considerably lower than they have been for many years past. The snow, which fell in great quantities on the night of Sunday the 9th, has been increased in a very considerable degree by repeated heavy showers, and the whole rendered particularly severe by the high winds which prevailed during the earlier part of the storm, drifting the snow in many situations in such a manner as to make travelling very tedious, as well as dangerous, and in some places entirely blocking up the roads. The effect has been to render the arrival of the post and carriers very uncertain. The former have for a week past been several hours later than the usual time. Our market on Wednesday was very thinly attended, it having been found in many parts impossible to travel until the snow was cut. We understand the snow lay the deepest between Wigton and Cockermouth. A few miles to the south of this town there was little in comparison, but a great deal fell on Sunday last, and we hear that towards the evening it was nearly 3 feet deep on the road between Whitehaven and Egremont. Dublin, January 14th. It is supposed that the present fall of snow has been as heavy as any ever known in Ireland, but as to the quantity there seems to be no doubt of its being greater than ever before experienced in the same space of time. In this respect we can answer that it is unparalleled for half a century, upon the authority of a very intelligent gentleman in this city, who has kept a regular diary of the weather for the last 50 years. The snow preceding Monday was so slight as hardly to occasion even a remark, and yet, in the course of the day and night, it had descended so inconceivably thick and rapid as to block up all the roads in such a manner as to preclude the possibility of the mail coaches being able to proceed. One, indeed, and only one, from Galway, arrived the next morning. None has ventured to leave Dublin, and it was found impracticable to send the mails on horseback. Thus all intercourse with the interior has been cut off, and it was not until yesterday, when an intense frost suddenly commenced, that the communication was opened. About 2 o'clock the inhabitants of this city witnessed the gratifying sight of several mail-bags arriving from the country on horseback. The depths of snow in the streets of Dublin almost exceeds credibility. In many of the narrow streets, after the footways had been in some measure cleared, it was more than 6 feet. It was nearly impossible for any carriage to force a passage, and few ventured on the hazardous attempt. Many accidents, both distressing and fatal, occurred. The distress in that abode of poverty, the Liberty, is excessive. In many streets and lanes the wretched inhabitants were literally blocked up in their houses, and in the attempt to go abroad experienced every kind of misery that it is possible to imagine. It is painful to state that the number of deaths there have within the last few days been greater than at any other period, unless at the time of the plague. We are informed that 80 funerals occurred last Sunday. The coffin makers in Cook Street can with difficulty complete their numerous orders, and we are pained to state that not a few poor people have been lying dead in their rooms several days, from the impossibility of procuring assistance to convey them to the hospital fields, and the great difficulty and danger of attempting to open the ground, which is very uneven, and where the snow in some parts is perhaps 20 feet deep. Canterbury, January 25th. From the drifted state of the roads, the communication with the metropolis was not open until Saturday, when the snow was cut through by the military at Chatham Hill and near Gravesend, and the stages proceeded with their passengers which had been detained from Wednesday night. The mail of Thursday night arrived here late on Friday evening, the bags having been conveyed part of the distance upon men's shoulders. The bags of Friday and Saturday night arrived together on Sunday morning about 10 o'clock, and yesterday the mail coach reached this city about noon. Dalrymple, North Britain, January 29th. Wednesday, the 26th, was an epoch ever to be remembered by the inhabitants of this village. The thaw of that and the preceding day had opened the dune, formerly bound like a rock, to a considerable distance above this, and the melting of the snow on the adjacent hills swelled the river beyond its usual depth, which burst up vast fragments of ice and congealed snow, forcing them forward with irresistible impetuosity, bending trees like willows, carrying down Skelton Bridge and sweeping all before it. Thus proceeded the overwhelming torrent in awful majesty, till it had accumulated a most prodigious mass of the frozen element, which, as if in wanton frolic, it heaved out into the fields on both sides, covering acres of ground many feet deep. Alternately loading and discharging in this manner, it called at a door or two in the village, as if it were to apprise us of its approach. Impatient of restraint, it deserted its wonted channel, trying to make its grand entry by several courses successively in Saint Valley, and finding no one of them sufficient for its reception, it took them all together, overrunning the whole home at once, then appeared here in terrific grandeur between 7 and 8 o'clock in the evening, when the moon, shrinking from so dreadful a sight and concealing herself behind a cloud, and the gloom of night added to the horrors of this tremendous scene. Like a sea, it overflowed all the gardens on the east side from the cross to the bridge, and invaded the houses behind by the doors and windows, lifting and tumbling the furniture, extinguishing the fires in a moment, and gushing out at the front doors with incredible rapidity. But its principal inroad was by the end of a bridge. Here, while the houses stood as a bank on either side, it came crashing and roaring up the street in full career, casting forth, within a few yards of the cross, floats of ice like millstones. By this time the houses on the west side were in the same situation with those on the east. At one place the water was running on the house eaves, at another it was near the door-head, and midway up the street it stood 3.5 feet above the door. Happily for us it did not advance 5 minutes longer in this direction, or the whole village had been inundated. The consternation of spectators not unconcerned may be more easily conceived than described. Several have lost considerably, and many families have been expelled their own houses, into which the water is yet pouring, and obliged to seek shelter from their neighbours. We are still apprehensive of another attack, which, from the present local circumstances, will, in all probability, be worse than the first. Accidents. The following are a few of the casualties which have been the consequences of this severe weather. The body of a woman was found frozen to death on the Highgate Road. She proved to have been a charwoman returning from Highgate, where she had been at work, to Pancras. A poor woman named Wood, while crossing Blackheath from Lee to the village of Charlton, accompanied by her 2 children, was unfortunately benighted and missed her way. After various efforts to extricate herself, she fell into a hole and was nearly buried in the snow. From this, however, she contrived to escape, and again proceeded, but at length, being completely exhausted and her children benumbed with cold, she was constrained to sit down on the trunk of a tree, where, wrapping her children in her cloak, she endeavoured by loud cries to attract the attention of some passengers. Her shrieks at length were heard by a waggoner, who humanely waded through the snow to her assistance, and taking her children, who seemed in a torpid state, in his arms, conducted her to a public house. One of her poor infants was found to be completely dead, and the other was recovered with extreme difficulty. As a party of workmen were clearing away the snow which was 12 feet deep at Kipton on the border of Northamptonshire, a child about 3 years old was discovered, and immediately afterwards the mother, as was soon ascertained. The poor woman proved to be the wife of a soldier of the 16th Regiment, and she was returning home with her child after accompanying her husband to the place of embarkation. The poor unfortunates, it was supposed, had been a week in the snow. A respectable, well-dressed man was found lying in the road leading from Longford to Upham, frozen to death. The deceased turned out to be a Mr. Apthorn, a grazier at Coltsworth. He had left Hounslow at dusk on Monday evening after having drunk rather freely, and proposed to go that night to Marlow. His horse was found in a field on the roadside, and had evidently been down. He had property to the amount of £60 in his pockets, besides a watch and pocket-book. On his return from Wakefield Market, Mr. Husband of Holroyd Hill was found frozen to death, within little more than 100 yards of the house of his nephew, with whom he resided. Mr. Chapman, organist and master of the Central School at Andover, Hants, was frozen to death on Tuesday near Wallop in that county. A young man by the name of Monk, while driving a stagecoach near Reigate, was thrown off the box on a lump of frozen snow and killed on the spot. The thermometer during this intense frost was as low as 7 degrees and 8 degrees of Fahrenheit in the neighbourhood of London. End of introduction. Recording by Lewis Fletcher. Chapter 1 of Frostiana. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Frost. This is the state of man. Today he puts forth the tender leaves of hope, tomorrow blossoms, and bears his blushing honours thick upon him. The third day comes a frost, a killing frost, and when he thinks, good easy man, full surely, his greatness is a ripening, nips his root, and then he falls. Shakespeare. Of all known substances, the atmosphere either absorbs or throws out heat with the most remarkable facility, and in one or other of these states it always is with respect to the surface of the earth, and such bodies as are placed on or near it. For these, properly speaking, have no temperature of their own, but are entirely regulated by that of the atmosphere. When the air has been for some time absorbing the heat from terrestrial bodies, a frost must be the undoubted consequence, for the same reason that water freezes in a vessel which is placed in a freezing mixture, and were this absorption to continue for a length of time, the whole earth would be converted into a frozen mass. There are, however, certain powers in nature by which this effect is always prevented, and the most violent frost we can imagine must always, as it were, defeat its own purposes and end in a thaw. Freezing. This is the fixing a fluid body into a firm or solid mass by the action of cold. A computation of the force of freezing water has been made by the Florentine academicians from the bursting of a very strong brass globe or shell by freezing water in it, when, from the known thickness and tenacity of the metal, it was found that the expansive power of a spherule of water only 1 inch in diameter was sufficient to overcome a resistance of more than 27,000 pounds, or 13 tons and a half. Cold also usually tends to make bodies electric which are not so naturally, and to increase the electric properties of such as are so. And it is further found that all substances do not transmit cold equally well, but that the best conductors of electricity, that is, metals, are likewise the best conductors of cold. It may further be added that when cold has been carried to such an extremity as to render any body inelectric, it then ceases to conduct the cold as well as before. This is exemplified in the practice of the Laplanders and Siberians, where, to exclude the extreme cold of the winters from their habitations the more effectually, and yet to admit a little light, they cut pieces of ice, which in the winter time must always be electric in those countries, and put them into their windows, which they find to be much more effectual in keeping out the cold than any other substance. Excessive degrees of cold occur naturally in many parts of the globe in the winter season. Although the thermometer in this country hardly ever descends so low as 0, yet in the winter of 1780, Mr. Wilson of Glasgow observed that a thermometer laid on the snow sunk to 25 degrees below 0, and Mr. Derham in the year 1708 observed in England that the mercury stood within 1/10 of an inch of its station when plunged into a mixture of snow and salt. At Petersburg in 1732 the thermometer stood at 28 degrees below 0, and when the French academicians wintered near the polar circle, the thermometer sunk to 33 degrees below 0, and in the Asiatic and American continents still greater degrees of cold are often observed. Wonderful expansion of water in the act of freezing. Water and some other fluids suddenly dilate and expand in the act of freezing, so as to occupy a greater space in the form of ice than before, in consequence of which it is that the ice is specifically lighter than the same fluid, and floats in it. And the degree of expansion of water in the state of ice is by some authors computed at about 1/10 of its volume. Oil, however, is an exception to this property, and quicksilver too, which shrinks and contracts still more after freezing. Mr. Boyle relates several experiments of vessels made of metal, very thick and strong, in which, when filled with water, close stopped and exposed to the cold, the water being expanded and freezing and not finding either room or vent, bursts the vessels. A strong barrel of a gun, with water in it, close stopped and frozen, was rent the whole length. Huygens, to try the force with which it expands, filled a cannon with it, whose sides were an inch thick, and then closed up the mouth and vent so that none could escape, the whole being exposed to a strong freezing air. The water froze in about 12 hours and burst the piece in 2 places. Mathematicians have computed the force of the ice upon this occasion, and they say that such a force would raise a weight of 27,720 pounds. Major Edward Williams of the Royal Artillery made many experiments on the force of it at Quebec in 1784 and 1785. He filled all sizes of iron bombshells with water, then plugged the fuse hole close up, and exposed them to the strong freezing air of the winter in that climate, sometimes driving in the iron plugs as hard as possible with the sledgehammer, and yet they were always thrown out by the sudden expansion of the water in the act of freezing, like a ball shot by gunpowder, sometimes to the distance of between 400 and 500 feet, though they weighed nearly 3 pounds, and when the plugs were screwed in or furnished with hooks or barbs to lay hold of the inside of the shell so that they would not possibly be forced out in this case, the shell was always split in 2, though the thickness of the metal of the shell was about 1 3/4 inches. It is further remarkable that through the circular crack round about these shells where they burst, there stood out a thin film or sheet of ice like a fin, and in the cases where the plugs were projected by freezing water, there suddenly issued from the fuse hole a bolt of ice of the same diameter, and stood over it to the height of sometimes 8 inches and a half. And hence we need not be surprised at the effects of ice in destroying the substance of vegetables and trees, and even splitting rocks when the frost is carried to excess. Thames frozen, 1715–16. The beauties and usefulness of the Thames have been almost an endless theme. We shall here describe how it has contributed at various eras to the amusement of thousands when in a frozen state. In the frost of 1715–16 this advertisement appeared. This is to give notice to gentlemen and others that pass upon the Thames during this frost, that over against Whitehall stairs they may have their names printed, fit to paste in any book, to hand down the memory of the season to future ages. You that walk there and do design to tell your children's children what this year befell, go print your names and take a dram within, for such a year as this has seldom been. Dawkes's newsletter of the 14th of January says, "The Thames seems now a solid rock of ice, and booths for the sale of brandy, wine, ale, and other exhilarating liquors have been for some time fixed thereon, but now it is in a manner like a town. Thousands of people cross it, and with wonder view the mountainous heaps of water that now lie congealed into ice. On Thursday a great cook's shop was erected, and gentlemen went as frequently to dine there as at any ordinary. Over against Westminster, Whitehall, and Whitefriars, printing presses are kept upon the ice where many persons have their names printed, to transmit the wonders of the season to posterity. Coaches, waggons, carts, etc. were driven on it, and an enthusiastic preacher held forth to a motley congregation on the mighty waters, with a zeal fiery enough to have thawed himself through the ice had it been susceptible of religious warmth. This, with other pastimes and diversions, attracted the attention of many of the nobility, and even brought the Prince of Wales to visit Frost Fair. On that day there was an uncommonly high spring tide which overflowed the cellars on the banks of the river, and raised the ice full 14 feet without interrupting the people from their pursuits. The Protestant packet of this period observes that the theatres were almost deserted. The newsletter of February 13th announces the dissolution of the ice, and with it the baseless fabric on which Momus had held his temporary reign. The above paper then proclaims the good fair, and various articles to be seen and purchased. Thou beauteous river Thames, whose standing tide equals the glory of thy flowing pride, the city, nay, the world's transferred to thee, fixed as the land and richer than the sea. The various metals nature can produce, or art improve for ornament or use, from the earth's deepest bowels brought, are made to shine in thee and carry on thy trade. Here Guillaume famed for making silver pass through various forms, and sparks as famed for brass. There's T 'tween God and gold who ne'er stood neuter, and trusty Nicholson who lives by pewter. Wrote o'er their doors, having affixed their names, we underwrit, removed are to the Thames. There, miles together for the common good, the slippery substance offers dainty food. Here healing port wine, and there Rhenish flows, here Bohea tea, and there tobacco grows. In one place you may meet good Cheshire cheese, another proffers whitest Brentford peas. Here is King George's picture, there Queen Anne's, now nut-brown ale in cups and then in cans. One sells an Oxford dram as good as can be, another offers General Pepper's brandy. See, there's the mall, and in that little hut, the best Geneva's sold, and love to boot. See there, a sleek Venetian envoy walks, see here, an alderman more proudly stalks. Behold the French ambassador, that's he, and this the honest sire and Captain Lee. Here is St. James's Street, yonder the Strand, in this place Bowyer plies, that's Lintot's stand. Thames frozen, 1739–40. The winter of 1739–40 became memorable from its uncommon severity, and the occurrence of one of the most intense frosts that had ever been known in this country, and which from its piercing cold and long continuance has been recorded in our annals by the appellation of the Great Frost. It commenced on Christmas Day and lasted till the 17th of the following February, when it began to break up, but was not wholly dissipated till near the end of the month. The distress which it occasioned among the poor and labouring classes of London was extreme. Coals could hardly be obtained for money, and water was equally scarce. The watermen and fishermen with a peter boat in mourning, and the carpenters, bricklayers, etc., with their tools and utensils in mourning, walked through the streets in large bodies, imploring relief for their own and families' necessities, and, to the honour of the British character, this was liberally bestowed. Subscriptions were also made in the different parishes, and great benefactions bestowed by the opulent, through which the calamities of the season were much mitigated. A few days after the frost had set in, great damage was done among the shipping in the River Thames by a high wind, which broke many vessels from their moorings and drove them foul of each other, while the large flakes of ice there floated on the stream, overwhelmed various boats and lighters, and sunk several corn and coal vessels. By these accidents many lives were lost, and many others were also destroyed in the intenseness of the cold, both on land and water. Above bridge, the Thames was completely frozen over, and tents and numerous booths were erected on it for selling liquors, etc., to the multitudes that daily flocked thither for curiosity or diversion. The scene here displayed was very irregular, and had more the appearance of a fair on land than of a frail exhibition, the only basis of which was congealed water. Various shops were opened for the sale of toys, cutlery, and other light articles. Even a printing press was established, and all the common sports of the populace in a wintry season were carried on with augmented spirit, in despite or forgetfulness of the distress which reigned on shore. Many of the houses which at that time stood upon London Bridge, as well as the bridge itself, received considerable damage when the thaw commenced by the driving of the ice. The following is an exact copy of one of the papers printed upon the Thames during the memorable frost of 1740. The gentleman whose name appears in it, William Noble, M.A., had been one of a great number without doubt, who had their names printed upon the ice as a rarity, not likely again to happen. The original is in the possession of a gentleman of Whitehaven, but it is not known who the Mr. Noble was, whose name and designation it bears. The noble art and mystery of printing was first invented by J. Faust, 1441, and publicly practised by John Gutenberg, a soldier at Mentz, in High Germany, anno 1450. King Henry VI, anno 1457, sent 2 private messengers with 1,500 marks to procure one of the workmen. These prevailed on Frederick Corsellis to leave the printing house in disguise, who immediately came over with them, and first instructed the English in this most famous art at Oxford in the year 1459. William Noble, M.A. Amidst the arts which on the Thames appear, to tell the wonders of this icy year, printing claims prior place, which at one view erects a monument of that and you. Printed upon the River Thames, January 29th, in the 13th year of the reign of King George II, Anno Domini 1740. Frost of 1767–68. The beginnings of these years were both distinguished by a very severe frost, through which the price of provisions was greatly enhanced. The navigation of the River Thames was stopped, and the river below bridge had all the appearance of a general wreck. Ships, boats, and small craft lying in confusion amidst the ice, while others were either driven on shore or sunk by the driving shoals. Many persons perished by the severity of the weather, both on the water and on shore. During the latter frost, the price of butcher's meat grew so exorbitant that the Honourable Thomas Harley, Lord Mayor, proposed that bounties should be given for bringing fish to Billingsgate Market, and this plan having been carried into effect, the distresses of the poor were greatly alleviated by the cheap rates at which the markets were supplied. Thames frozen, 1788–89. In 1788, a frost began on the 25th of November and lasted 7 weeks. On the 5th of January, the thermometer stood at 11 degrees below the freezing point in the very midst of the city. The Thames was completely frozen over below London Bridge, and from the variety of booths, etc., erected on the ice, it assumed all the appearance of a fair. Even puppet shows and wild beasts were exhibited. The following diary of remarkable events during this severe frost is taken from the Gentleman's Magazine for 1789. Saturday, January 10th, 1789. 13 men brought a waggon with a ton of coals from Loughborough in Leicestershire to Carlton House as a present to His Royal Highness the Prince of Wales. As soon as they were emptied into the cellar, Mr. Welchie, clerk of the cellars, gave them 4 guineas, and as soon as the Prince was informed of it, His Highness gave them 20 guineas and ordered them a pot of beer each man. They performed their journey, which is 111 miles, in 11 days, and drew it all the way without any relief. Monday 12th. A young bear was baited on the ice, opposite to Redriff, which drew multitudes together, and fortunately no accident happened to interrupt their sport. Tuesday 13th. The Prince of Wales transmitted £1,000 to the Chamberlain for the benefit of the poor during the severe frost. Saturday 17th. The captain of a vessel lying off Rotherhithe, the better to secure the ship's cables, made an agreement with a publican for fastening a cable to his premises. In consequence, a small anchor was carried on shore and deposited in the cellar, while another cable was fastened round a beam in another part of the house. In the night the ship veered about, and the cables holding fast carried away the beam and levelled the house with the ground, by which accident 5 persons asleep in their beds were killed. In the commonplace notes for February 1789 it is remarked, "With the new year, new entertainments commenced, or more properly speaking, old sports were revived in the neighbourhood of London. The River Thames, which at this season usually exhibits a dreary scene of languor and indolence, was this year the stage on which there were all kinds of diversions. Bear baiting, festivals, pigs and sheep roasted, booths, turnabouts, and all the various amusements of Bartholomew Fair multiplied and improved, from Putney Bridge in Middlesex down to Redriff, was one continued scene of merriment and jollity, not a gloomy face to be seen, nor a countenance expressive of want, but all cheerfulness, originating apparently from busyness and bustle." From this description the reader is not, however, to conclude that all was as it seemed. The miserable inhabitants that dwelt in houses on both sides the river during these thoughtless exhibitions were many of them experiencing the extreme of misery. Destitute of employment, though industrious, they were with families of helpless children, for want of employment, pining for want of bread, and though in no country in the world the rich are more extensively benevolent than in England, yet their benefactions could bear no proportion to the wants of the numerous poor, who could not all partake of the common bounty. It may, however, be truly said that in no great city or country on the continent of Europe the poor suffered less from the rigour of the season than the inhabitants of Great Britain and London. Yet even in London the distresses of the poor were very great, and though liberal subscriptions were raised for their relief, many perished through want and cold. On this occasion the City of London subscribed £1,500 towards supporting the persons who were not in the habit of receiving alms. Thames frozen, 1814. The history of this great frost has already been detailed in our introduction. We shall now confine ourselves to the events which took place on the marble bosom of the now flowing Thames, from the 30th of January to the 7th of February inclusive. Sunday, January 30th. Immense masses of ice that had floated from the upper parts of the river, in consequence of the thaw on the 2 preceding days, now blocked up the Thames between Blackfriars and London Bridge, and afforded every probability of its being frozen over in a day or 2. Some venturous persons even now walked on different parts of the ice. Monday, January 31st. This expectation was realized. During the whole of the afternoon hundreds of people were assembled on Blackfriars and London bridges to see several adventurous men cross and recross the Thames on the ice. At one time 70 persons were counted walking from Queenhithe to the opposite shore. The frost on Sunday night so united the vast mass as to render it immovable by the tide. Tuesday, February 1st. The floating masses of ice with which we have already stated the Thames to be covered, having been stopped by London Bridge, now assumed the shape of a solid surface over that part of the river which extends from Blackfriars Bridge to some distance below Three Crane Stairs, at the bottom of Queen Street, Cheapside. The watermen, taking advantage of this circumstance, placed notices at the end of all the streets leading to the city side of the river, announcing a safe footway over the river, which, as might be expected, attracted immense crowds to witness so novel a scene. Many were induced to venture on the ice, and the example thus afforded soon led thousands to perambulate the rugged plain, where a variety of amusements were prepared for their entertainment. Among the more curious of these was the ceremony of roasting a small sheep, which was toasted, or rather burnt, over a coal fire, placed in a large iron pan. For a view of this extraordinary spectacle, 6d. was demanded, and willingly paid. The delicate meat, when done, was sold at 1 shilling a slice, and termed Lapland mutton. Of booths there were a great number, which were ornamented with streamers, flags, and signs, and in which there was a plentiful store of those favourite luxuries, gin, beer, and gingerbread. Opposite Three Crane Stairs there was a complete and well-frequented thoroughfare to Bankside, which was strewed with ashes, and apparently afforded a very safe, although a very rough, path. Near Blackfriars Bridge, however, the path did not appear to be equally safe, for one young man, a plumber named Davis, having imprudently ventured to cross with some lead in his hands, he sank between two masses of ice to rise no more. 2 young women nearly shared a similar fate, but were happily rescued from their perilous situation by the prompt efforts of 2 watermen. Many a fair nymph indeed was embraced in the icy arms of old Father Thames. 3 prim young Quakeresses had a sort of semi-bathing near London Bridge, and when landed on terra firma, made the best of their way through the borough, and amidst the shouts of an admiring populace to their residence at Newington. In consequence of the impediments to the current of the river at London Bridge, the tide did not ebb for some days more than 1/2 the usual mark. Wednesday, February 2nd. The same sports were repeated, and the Thames presented a complete frost fair. The grand mall or walk was from Blackfriars Bridge to London Bridge. This was named the City Road, and lined on each side with tradesmen of all descriptions. 8 or 10 printing presses were erected, and numerous pieces commemorative of the great frost were actually printed on the ice. Some of these frosty typographers displayed considerable taste in their specimens. At one of the presses an orange-coloured standard was hoisted, with the watchword "Orange Boven" in large characters, and the following papers were issued from it. Frost Fair. Amidst the arts which on the Thames appear, to tell the wonders of this icy year, printing claims prior place, which at one view erects a monument of that and you. Another, you that walk here and do design to tell your children's children what this year befell, come buy this print, and it will then be seen that such a year as this has seldom been. Another of these stainers of paper addressed the spectators in the following terms: Friends, now is your time to support the freedom of the press. Can the press have greater liberty? Here you find it working in the middle of the Thames, and if you encourage us by buying our impressions, we will keep it going in the true spirit of liberty during the frost. One of the articles printed and sold contained the following lines: Behold the River Thames is frozen o'er, which lately ships of mighty burden bore. Now different arts and pastimes here you see, but printing claims the superiority. Besides the above, the Lord's Prayer and several other pieces were issued from these icy printing offices, and which were bought with the greatest avidity. Thursday, February 3rd. The adventurers were still more numerous. Swings, bookstalls, dancing in a barge, sutling booths, playing at skittles, and almost every appendage of a fair on land was now transferred to the Thames. Thousands of people flocked to behold this singular spectacle, and to partake of the various sports and pastimes. The ice now became like a solid rock of adamant, and presented a truly picturesque appearance. The view of St. Paul's and of the city with the white foreground had a very singular effect. In many parts, mountains of ice were upheaved, and these fragments bore a strong resemblance to the rude interior of a stone quarry. Friday, February 4th. Every day brought a fresh accession of pedlars to sell their wares, and the greatest rubbish of all sorts was raked up and sold at double and treble the original cost. Books and toys labelled "Bought on the Thames" were seen in profusion. The watermen profited exceedingly, for each person paid a toll of 2d. or 3d. before he was admitted to Frost Fair. Some douceur also was expected on your return. These men are said to have taken £6 each in the course of a day. This afternoon, about 5 o'clock, 3 persons, an old man and 2 lads, having ventured on a piece of ice above London Bridge, it suddenly detached itself from the main body and was carried by the tide through one of the arches. The persons on the ice who laid themselves down for safety were observed by the boatmen at Billingsgate, who, with laudable activity, put off to their assistance and rescued them from their impending danger. One of them was able to walk, but the other 2 were carried in a state of insensibility to a public house, where they received every attention their situation required. Many persons were seen on the ice till late at night, and the effect by moonlight was singularly picturesque and beautiful. With a single stretch of imagination, we might have transported ourselves to the frozen climes of the north, to Lapland, Sweden, or Holland. Saturday, February 5th. The morning of this day augured rather unfavourably for the continuance of frost fare. The wind had shifted to the south, and a light fall of snow took place. The visitors of the Thames, however, were not to be deterred by trifles. Thousands again ventured, and there was still much life and bustle on the frozen element. The footpath in the centre of the river was hard and secure, and among the pedestrians we observed 4 donkeys, which trotted a nimble pace and produced considerable merriment. At every glance the spectator met with some pleasing novelty. Gaming, in all its branches, threw out different allurements, while honesty was out of the question. Many of the itinerant admirers of the profits gained by E.O. tables, rouge et noir, teetotum, wheel of fortune, the garter, etc., were industrious in their avocations, leaving their kind customers without a penny to pay the passage over a plank to the shore. Skittles was played by several parties, and the drinking tents filled by females and their companions, dancing reels to the sound of fiddles, while others sat round large fires, drinking rum, grog, and other spirits. Tea, coffee, and eatables were provided in ample order, while the passengers were invited to eat by way of recording their visit. Several respectable tradesmen also attended with their wares, selling books, toys, and trinkets of every description. Towards the evening, the concourse became thinned, rain fell in some quantity. Maester Ice gave some loud cracks, and floated with the printing presses, booths, etc., to the no small dismay of publicans, typographers, etc. In short, this icy palace of Momus, this frost fairy work, was soon to be dissolved, and was doomed to vanish like the baseless fabric of a vision, but leaving some wrecks behind. A short time previously to this great event, a gentleman standing by one of the printing presses, and supposed to be a limb of the law, handed the following jus d'esprit to its conductor, requesting that it might be printed on the Thames. The prophecy which it contains has been most remarkably fulfilled. To Madam Tabitha Thor. Dear dissolving dame, Father Frost and Sister Snow have bonied my borders, formed an idol of ice upon my bosom, and all the lads of London come to make merry. Now as you love mischief, treat the multitude with a few cracks by a sudden visit, and obtain the prayers of the poor upon both banks. Given at my own press, the 5th of February 1814. Thomas Thames. It was evident that a thaw was rapidly taking place, yet such was the indiscretion and heedlessness of some persons that one most fatal accident occurred. 2 genteel-looking young men fell victims to their temerity in venturing on the ice above Westminster Bridge, notwithstanding the warnings of the watermen. A large mass on which they stood, and which had been loosened by the flood tide, gave way, and they floated down the stream. As they passed under Westminster Bridge, they cried out most piteously for help. They had not gone far before they sat down, but both going too near the edge, they overbalanced the mass and were precipitated into the stream, sinking to rise no more. This morning also, Mr. Lawrence, of the Feathers, in High Timber Street, Queenhithe, erected a booth on the Thames opposite Brook's Wharf, for the accommodation of the curious. At 9 at night he left it to the care of 2 men, taking away all the liquors except some gin which he gave them for their own use. Sunday, February 6th. At 2 o'clock this morning the tide began to flow with great rapidity at London Bridge. The thaw assisted the efforts of the tide, and the booth just mentioned was hurried along with the quickness of lightning towards Blackfriars Bridge. There were 9 men in it, and in their alarm they neglected the fire and candles, which, communicating with the covering, set it in a flame. The men succeeded in getting into a lighter which had broken from its moorings, but it was dashed to pieces against one of the piers of Blackfriars Bridge, on which 7 of them got and were taken off safely. The other 2 got into a barge while passing Puddle Dock. On this day the Thames, towards high tide, about 3 p.m., presented a very tolerable idea of the frozen ocean, Grand masses of ice floating along, added to the great height of the water, afforded a striking object for contemplation. Thousands of disappointed persons thronged the banks, and many apprentice boy and servant maid sighed unmutterable things at the sudden and unlooked-for destruction of Frostfair. Monday, February 7th. Large masses of ice are yet floating, and numerous lighters, broken from their moorings, are seen in different parts of the river, many of them complete wrecks. The damage done to the craft and barges is supposed to be very great. From London Bridge to Westminster, £20,000 will scarcely make good the losses that have been sustained. While we are now writing, 2:30 p.m, a printing press has been again set up on a large ice island between Blackfriars and Westminster Bridges. At this new printing office, the remainder of a large impression of the title page of the present work is now actually being printed, so that the purchasers of Frostiana will have this additional advantage. Freezing rain, or raining ice. This is a very uncommon kind of shower which fell in the west of England in December 1672. This rain, as soon as it touched anything above ground, as a bough or the like, immediately settled into ice, and, by multiplying and enlarging the icicles, broke all down with its weight. The rain that fell on the snow immediately froze into ice without sinking in the snow at all. It made an incredible destruction of trees, beyond anything in all history. Had it concluded with some gust of wind, says a gentleman on the spot, it might have been of terrible consequence. I weighed the sprig of an ash tree of just 3/4 of a pound, the ice on which weighed 16 pounds. Some were frighted with the noise in the air, till they discerned it was the clatter of icy boughs dashed against each other. Dr. Beale observes that there was no considerable frost observed on the ground during the whole, whence he concludes that a frost may be very intense and dangerous on the tops of some hills and plains, while in other places it keeps at 2, 3, or 4 feet distance above the ground, rivers, lakes, etc. The frost was followed by a forwardness of flowers and fruits. Influence of frost on health. The salutary influence of frosty seasons on the health of mankind is not in the least confirmed by the annual bills of mortality, as many old and debilitated persons, whose vital heat is insufficient to excite into action their vessels, already too unsusceptible of irritation, die in consequence of long frosts during severe winters. Birds and other wild animals, as well as tender vegetables, perish benumbed from the same cause. It deserves, however, to be remarked that a sharp dry frost does not affect the human skin with that sensation of chilly and piercing cold which we experience when the air is loaded with moisture, the temperature of which is near the freezing point. This remarkable difference arises from the intense degree of cold produced by the evaporation of fluids, which continually takes place on the surface of living bodies, where it naturally produces a more perceptible effect than the simple contact of dry air would occasion when it is but a few degrees below freezing. To the young and robust, frost is more pleasing than moist air, as in the former they are able to keep themselves warm with increased exercise, which, in the latter, only tends to promote and render the evaporation more severely felt on the skin. For the same reason, severe and continued frosts destroy the children of the poor, who want both food, fire, and clothing in this harsh climate. In cold countries, the frost frequently proves fatal to mankind, not only producing mortification, but even death itself. The hands of those unfortunate persons who die in consequence of intense cold are first seized, till they lose the sense of feeling. Next, a drowsiness pervades the whole body, which, if indulged in, is attended with imperceptible dissolution. Frozen market at St. Petersburg. To strangers, unaccustomed to the various changes produced in men and things by the influence of intense frost, nothing appears more wonderful or noteworthy than that part of the city dedicated to the sale of frozen provisions. Your astonished sight is there arrested by a vast open square, containing the bodies of many thousand animals, piled in pyramidical heaps on all sides. Cows, sheep, hogs, fowls, butter, eggs, fish, all stiffened into granite. The fish are attractively beautiful, possessing the vividness of their living colour, with the transparent clearness of wax imitations. The beasts present a far less pleasing spectacle, most of the larger sort being skinned and classed according to their species. Groups of many hundreds are seen piled upon their hind legs against one another, as if each were making an effort to climb over the back of its neighbour. The motionless yet apparent animation of their seemingly struggling attitudes, as if suddenly seized and moving and petrified by frost, gives a horrid life to this dead scene. Had an enchanter's wand been instantaneously waved over this sea of animals during their different actions, they could not have been fixed more decidedly. Their hardness, too, is so extreme that the natives chop them up for purchases like wood. The provisions collected here are the product of countries many thousand wersts distant. Siberia, Archangel, and still remoter provinces furnish the merchandise which, during the frost's severity, is conveyed hither on sledges. In consequence of the multitudes of these commodities, and the short period allowed to the existence of the market, they are cheaper than at any other period of the year, and are, therefore, bought in large quantities to be laid up as a winter stock. When deposited in cellars, they keep for a length of time. At certain hours every day, the market, while it lasts, is a fashionable lounge. There you meet all the beauty and gaiety of St. Petersburg, even from the imperial family down to the Russian merchant's wife. Incredible crowds of sledges, carriages, and pedestrians throng the place. The different groups of spectators, purchasers, vendors, and commodities form such an extraordinary spectacle as no other city is known to equal. Chronological table of remarkable frosts throughout Europe. AD 220. A frost in Britain lasted 5 months. 250. The Thames frozen 9 weeks. 291. Rivers in Britain frozen 6 weeks. 359. Frost in Scotland for 14 weeks. 508. Rivers in Britain frozen 2 months. 695. Thames frozen 6 weeks and booths built on it. 759. Frost from October 1st till February 26th, 760. 827. Frost in England for 9 weeks. 923. The Thames frozen 13 weeks. 987. Frost lasted 120 days, began December 22nd. 998. The Thames frozen 5 weeks. 1035. Severe frost on June 24th, the corn and fruits destroyed. 1063. The Thames frozen 14 weeks. 1076. Frost in England from November till April 1077. 1205. Frost from January 15th till March 22nd. 1407. Frost that lasted 15 weeks. 1434. From November 24th till February 10th, 1435. Thames frozen down to Gravesend. 1683. Frost for 13 weeks. 1708 and 09. Severe frost for many weeks. 1739 and 40. One for 9 weeks, began December 24th. 1742. Severe frost for many weeks. 1747. Severe frost in Russia. 1754. Severe one in England. 1767 to 68. Severe frost, navigation of the Thames stopped. 1776. The same in England. 1788 to 89. The Thames frozen below bridge and booths erected on it. 1791. Frost and snow in different parts of England at midsummer. 1794. Hard frost of many weeks. Thermometer at London mostly at 20 below zero of Fahrenheit. 1796. Most intense cold on Christmas Day. 1813 to 14. A frost of almost unparalleled severity commenced December 27th and broke up February 5th. End of Chapter 1. Recording by Lewis Fletcher. Chapter 2 of Frostiana. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Snow. Through the hushed air the whitening shower descends, at first thin wavering, till at last the flakes fall broad and wide and fast, dimming the day with a continual snow. Thomson. Snow is formed by the freezing of the vapours in the atmosphere. The snow we receive may, properly enough, be ascribed to the coldness of the atmosphere through which it falls. When the atmosphere is warm enough to dissolve the snow before it arrives to us, we call it rain. If it preserve itself undissolved, it makes what we call snow. It differs from the particles of hoar frost in being crystallized, as it were, which they are not. It appears on the examination of a flake of snow by a magnifying glass, when the whole of it will seem composed of fine shining spicula, or points, diverging like rays from a centre. As the flakes fall down through the atmosphere, they are continually joined by more of these radiated spicula, and thus increase in bulk like the drops of rain or hailstones. Dr. Grew, in a discourse on the nature of snow, observes that many parts of it are of a regular figure, for the most part so many little rowels or stars of 6 points, and are as perfect and transparent ice as any we see on a pond. Upon each of these points are other collateral points, set at the same angles as the main points themselves, among which there are diverse points, some regular and others irregular, which are chiefly broken points and fragments of the regular ones. Others also, by various winds, seem to have been thawed and frozen again into irregular clusters, so that it seems as if the whole body of snow were an infinite mass of icicles irregularly figured. That is, a cloud of vapours being gathered into drops, those drops forthwith descend, and in their descent, meeting with a freezing air as they pass through a colder region, each drop is immediately frozen into an icicle, shooting itself forth into several points. But these, still continuing their descent and meeting with some intermitting gales of warmer air, or in their continual waftage to and fro, touching upon each other, are a little thawed, blunted, and frozen into clusters, or entangled so as to fall down in what we call flakes. According to Signor Beccaria, clouds of snow differ in nothing from clouds of rain, but in the circumstances of cold that freezes them. Both the regular diffusion of snow and the irregularity of the structure of its parts, particularly some figures of snow or hail, which he calls rosette, and which fall about Turin, show the clouds of snow to be acted upon by some uniform cause like electricity. He even endeavours, very particularly, to show in what manner certain configurations of snow are made by the uniform action of electricity. He was confirmed in his reasonings on this subject by observing that his apparatus never failed to be electrified by snow as well as by rain, and he adds that a more intense electricity unites the particles of hail more closely than the more moderate electricity does those of snow. Snow, although it seems to be soft, is really hard because it is true ice. It seems soft because, at the first touch of the finger upon its sharp edges or points, they melt, otherwise they would pierce the finger like so many lancets. The lightness of snow, although it is firm ice, is owing to the excess of its surface, in comparison to the matter contained under it. And thus gold, the most ponderous of all bodies, when beaten into leaves will ride upon the least breath of air. The whiteness of snow is owing to the small particles into which it is divided, for ice, when pounded, will become equally white. The beauties of snow have been abundantly illustrated by poets, both ancient and modern, but what can be more minutely circumstantial or more elegantly accurate than the following description of snow from our own admirable poet of the seasons? The keener tempests rise, and, foaming done, from all the livid east or piercing north, thick clouds ascend, in whose capacious womb a vapoury deluge lies, to snow congealed. Heavy they roll their fleecy world along, and the sky saddens with the gathered storm. The cherished fields put on their winter robe of purest white, 'tis brightness all, save where the new snow melts. Along the mazy current, lo, the woods bow their hoary head, and ere the languid sun, faint from the west, emits his evening ray, earth's universal face, deep hid and chill, is one wide dazzling waste that buries wide the works of man. The same author has beautifully described the effects which the inclemency of the season has upon animals, and particularly the feathered tribes, while the snow is upon the ground. Drooping, the labourer ox stands covered over with snow, and then demands the fruit of all his toil. The fowls of heaven, tamed by the cruel season, crowd around the winnowing store and claim the little boon which Providence assigns them. One alone, the redbreast, sacred to the household gods, in joyless fields and thorny thickets leaves his shivering mates and pays to trusted man his annual visit. Half afraid, he first against the window beats, then brisk alights on the warm hearth, then, hopping o'er the floor, eyes all the smiling family askance, and pecks and starts and wonders where he is, till more familiar grown the table crumbs attract his slender feet. The foodless wilds pour forth their brown inhabitants. The hare, though timorous of heart and hard beset by death in various form, dark snares and dogs, and more unpitying men the garden seeks, urged on by fearless want. The bleating kind eye the bleak heaven, and next the glistening earth, with looks of dumb despair, then, sad, dispersed, dig for the wintered herb through heaps of snow. Uses of snow. We are not to consider snow merely as a curious and beautiful phenomenon. The great dispenser of universal bounty has so ordered it that it is eminently subservient, as well as all the works of creation, to his benevolent designs. Were we to judge from appearances only, we might imagine that so far from being useful to the earth, the cold humidity of snow would be detrimental to vegetation, but the experience of all ages asserts the contrary. Snow, particularly in those northern regions where the ground is covered with it for several months, fructifies the earth by guarding the corn or other vegetables from the intenser cold of the air, and especially from the cold-piercing winds. It has been a vulgar opinion, very generally received, that snow fertilizes the land on which it falls more than rain, in consequence of the nitrous salts which it is supposed to acquire by freezing. But it appears from the experiments of Marggraf in the year 1751 that the chemical difference between rain and snow water is exceedingly small, and that the latter, however, is somewhat less nitrous, and contains a somewhat less proportion of earth than the former. But neither of them contain either earth or any kind of salt in any quantity which can be sensibly efficacious in promoting vegetation. Allowing, therefore, that nitre is a fertilizer of lands, which many are, upon good grounds, disposed utterly to deny, yet so very small is the quantity of it contained in snow that it cannot be supposed to promote the vegetation of plants upon which the snow has fallen. The peculiar agency of snow as a fertilizer in preference to rain may, without recurring to nitrous salts supposed to be contained in it, be rationally ascribed to its furnishing a covering to the roots of vegetables, by which they are guarded from the influence of the atmospherical cold, and the internal heat of the earth is prevented from escaping. And hence Bodinus, in his Theatrum Naturae, observes that the psalmist compares snow to wool, rather on account of the warmth it affords to vegetables in the cold of winter as woolen garments do to men, than of its fleecy resemblance. Snow may also fertilize the earth, agreeably to the hypothesis of those who make oil the food of plants, by means of the oily particles which it contains. Besides, snow, in melting, moistens and pulverizes the soil, which has been bound up by the frost, and, as its water has a tendency to putrefaction, it seems, on many accounts, without admitting it to contain any nitre, to be admirably fitted to promote vegetation. Another reason of the usefulness of snow has been suggested by Mr. Parkes. Fur and down afford warm clothing in consequence of the air they enfold within them, atmospheric air being a non-conductor of heat. Hence it is that the carpet which covers the earth in winter is spread out by nature with so light a hand that it might hold an abundance of atmospheric air within its interstices, to preserve the warmth of those innumerable tribes of vegetables which it is destined to protect. Artificial snow. An artificial snow has been made by the following experiment. A tall file of aqua fortis being placed in the fire till it is warm, and filings of pure silver, a few at a time, being put into it. After a brisk ebullition, the silver will dissolve slowly, the phial being then placed in a cold window. As it cools, the silver particles will shoot into crystals, several of which running together will form a flake, resembling snow, and descend to the bottom of the phial. While they are descending, they represent perfectly a shower of silver snow, and the flakes will lie one upon another at the bottom, like real snow upon the ground. In a word, a shower of snow, although so common with us and therefore so little regarded, is in itself a most beautiful spectacle, and is considered by the natives of southern climes on their arrival here as the most extraordinary and amazing phenomenon of nature. Snow slips. It often happens that when snow has long been accumulated on the tops and on the sides of mountains, it is borne down the precipice either by means of tempests or its own melting. At first, when loosened, the volume in motion is but small, and gathers as it continues to roll, and by the time it has reached the habitable parts of the mountain, is generally grown of enormous bulk. Wherever it rolls, it levels all things in its way, or buries them in unavoidable destruction. Instead of rolling, it sometimes is found to slide along from the top, yet even thus it is generally as fatal as before. Nevertheless, an instance has been cited, some time since, of a small family in Germany that lived for above a fortnight beneath one of these snow slips. Although they were buried during that whole time in utter darkness and under a bed of some 100 feet deep, yet they were luckily taken out alive, the weight of the snow being supported by a beam that kept up the roof, and nourishment being supplied them by the milk of an ass that was buried under the same ruin. Account of a woman buried in the snow for 8 days. A well-authenticated anecdote of a woman surviving nearly 8 days buried in the snow, without food, occurred near Impington in Cambridgeshire, and is related by Mr. Oakes, the surgeon who attended her, in the Annals of Medicine for the year 1799. Elizabeth Woodcock, aged 42, of a slender, delicate make, on her return from Cambridge on the evening of the 2nd of February, being exhausted with running after her horse which had started from her, and becoming numbed in the hands and feet, sat down on the ground. At that time a small quantity of snow had but drifted near her, but it began to accumulate very rapidly, and when Chesterton bells had rung at 8 o'clock she was completely enclosed and penned in by it. To the best of her recollection, she slept very little during the first night. On the morning of the third, observing before her a circular hole in the snow about 2 feet in length and half a foot in diameter, running obliquely upwards and closed with a thin covering of ice or snow, she broke off a branch of a bush that was close to her, and with it thrust her handkerchief through the hole as a signal of distress. In consequence of the external air being admitted, she felt herself very cold. On the second morning of her imprisonment the hole was again closed up, and continued so till the third day, after which time it remained open. She heard distinctly the ringing of the village bells, noises on the highway, and even the conversation of some gypsies who passed near her, but could not make herself heard. She easily distinguished day and night, and could even read an almanac she took from her pocket. The sensation of hunger ceased almost entirely after the first day. Thirst was throughout her predominant feeling, and this she had the plentiful means of allaying by sucking the surrounding snow. She felt no gratification from the use of her snuff. On Friday the 8th, when a thaw took place, she felt uncommonly faint and languid, and her clothes were wet quite through by the melted snow. The aperture becoming enlarged, she attempted in vain to disengage herself from her perilous situation. On Sunday the 10th, a little after midday, she was discovered. A piece of biscuit and a small quantity of brandy were given her, from which she found herself greatly recruited, but she was so much exhausted that, on being lifted into the chaise, she fainted. Mr. Oakes saw her that day on her way home. He found her hands and arms sodden, but not very cold, and her pulse did not indicate the great debility which might have been expected. Her legs were cold, and her feet in a great measure mortified. She was directed to be put into bed without delay, and to take some weak broth occasionally, but no strong liquors, and not to be brought near the fire. Next day she was affected with symptoms of fever. Her pulse was rising, her face was flushed, and her breathing short, occasioned, probably, by having taken too much food, and being incommoded by the crowd of visitors. Her feet were also in a complete state of mortification, her ankles cold and benumbed, and the integuments puffy. Cloths wetted with brandy were applied to her feet. Some antifebrile remedies and a little opium were given her. The mortification, however, proceeded, and on the 17th of March all the toes were removed, and the bones of the heels were bare in many parts. On the 17th of April, the date of the last report, her appetite was becoming tolerably good, and her health was improving. The hot bath and snow bath. Almost all the Finnish peasants have a small house built on purpose for a bath. It consists of only one small chamber, in the innermost part of which are placed a number of stones, which are heated by fire until they become red. On these stones, thus heated, water is thrown, until the company within be involved in a thick cloud of vapour. In this innermost part the chamber is formed into 2 stories for the accommodation of a greater number of persons within that small compass, and it being the nature of heat and vapour to ascend, the second story is, of course, the hottest. Men and women use the bath promiscuously, without any concealment of dress, or being in the least influenced by any emotions of attachment. If, however, a stranger open the door and come on the bathers by surprise, the women are not a little startled at his appearance, for besides his person he introduces along with him, by opening the door, a great quantity of light, which discovers at once to the view their situation as well as forms. Without such an accident they remain, if not in total darkness, yet in great obscurity, as there is no other window besides a small hole, nor any light but what enters in through some chink in the roof of the house, or the crevices between the pieces of wood of which it is constructed. I often amused myself, says Achirby, with surprising the bathers in this manner, and I once or twice tried to go in and join the assembly, but the heat was so excessive that I could not breathe, and in the space of a minute at most, I verily believe, must have been suffocated. I sometimes stepped in for a moment, just to leave my thermometer in some proper place, and immediately went out again, where I would remain for a quarter of an hour or 10 minutes, and then enter again and fetch the instrument to ascertain the degree of heat. My astonishment was so great that I could scarcely believe my senses when I found that these people remained together and amused themselves for the space of half an hour, and sometimes a whole hour, in the same chamber, heated to the 70th or 75th degree of Celsius. The thermometer, in contact with those vapours, became sometimes so hot that I could scarcely hold it in my hands. The Finlanders, all the while they are in this hot bath, continue to rub themselves, and lash every part of their bodies with switches formed of twigs of the birch tree. In 10 minutes they become as red as raw flesh, and have altogether a very frightful appearance. In the winter season they frequently go out of the bath, naked as they are, to roll themselves in the snow, when the cold is at even 20 and 30 degrees below zero. I speak always of the thermometer of 100 degrees by Celsius. They will sometimes come out, still naked, and converse together, or with anyone near them in the open air. If travellers happen to pass by while the peasants of any hamlet or little village are in the bath, and their assistance is needed, they will leave the bath and assist in yoking and unyoking and fetching provender for the horses or in anything else, without any sort of covering whatever, while the passenger sits shivering with cold, though wrapped up in a good sound wolf's skin. There is nothing more wonderful than the extremities which man is capable of enduring through the power of habit. The Finnish peasants pass thus instantaneously from an atmosphere of 70 degrees of heat to one of 30 degrees of cold, a transition of 100 degrees, which is the same thing as going out of boiling into freezing water. And what is more astonishing, without the least inconvenience, while other people are very sensibly affected by a variation of but 5 degrees, and in danger of being afflicted with rheumatism by the most trifling wind that blows, those peasants assure you that without the hot vapour baths they could not sustain as they do during the whole day their various labours. By the bath, they tell you, their strength is recruited as much as by rest and sleep. The heat of the vapour mollifies to such a degree their skin, that the men easily shave themselves with wretched razors and without soap. Had the immortal Shakespeare known of a people who could thus have pleasure in such a quick transition from excessive heat to the severest cold, his knowledge might have been increased, but his creative fancy could not have been assisted. Oh, who can hold a fire in his hand by thinking of the frosty Caucasus, or wallow naked in December snow by thinking on fantastic summer's heat? Thomson's description of a man lost in the snow. As thus the snows arise, and foul and fierce all winter drives along the darkened air, in his own loose revolving fields the swain, disastered, stands, sees other hills ascend of unknown joyless brow, and other scenes of horrid prospect shag the trackless plain, nor finds the river nor the forest head beneath the formless wild, but wanders on, from hill to dale, still more and more astray, impatient flouncing through the drifted heaps, stung with the thoughts of home, the thoughts of home, rush on his nerves and call their vigour forth, in many a vain attempt, how sinks his soul, what black despair, what horror fills his heart, when for the dusky spot which fancy feigned, his tufty cottage rising through the snow, he meets the roughness of the middle waste, far from the track and blest abode of man, while round him night restless closes fast, and every tempest howling o'er his head renders the savage wilderness more wild, than throng the busy shapes into his mind of covered pits unfathomably deep. A dire descent beyond the power of frost, of faithless bogs, of precipices huge, smoothed up with snow, and what is land unknown, what water of the still frozen spring, in the loose marsh or solitary lake, where the fresh fountain from the bottom boils. These check his fearful steps, and down he sinks beneath the shelter of the shapeless drift, thinking o'er the bitterness of death, mixed with the tender anguish nature shoots through the wrung bosom of the dying man, his wife, his children, and his friends unseen. In vain for him the officious wife prepares, the fire fair blazing and the vestment warm. In vain his little children peeping out into the mingling storm demand their sire with tears of artless innocence. Alas! Nor wife nor children more shall he behold, nor friends nor sacred home. On every nerve the deadly winter seizes, shuts up sense, and o'er his inmost vitals creeping cold, lays him along the snows a stiffened corpse, stretched out and bleaching in the northern blast. End of Chapter 2. Recording by Lewis Fletcher.